Hi everyone, Phil Seymour here, President of IBA. I'm joined today by Geoff, who runs the advisory business at IBA, and Hash, who runs the Commercial Aircraft Valuation division. And we're going to be talking about the A380. It's a much maligned aircraft. Passengers love it, I love it, but actually economically, is it challenged? We always thought it would be a bit of a battle, but we're going to talk today about the pros and cons and the issues that we see with the aircraft, but also some of the benefits and why it seems to be getting a second life in the industry. Is there going to be a second lease of life for the A380?
Well, I think we have seen quite a big comeback in the A380 coming out of the pandemic. Clearly demand has come back very quickly. We're up to about 83% of flights now compared to pre-pandemic, and it probably would be higher than that if it wasn't for some of the lockdowns in China. Airlines need the capacity. So I think those airlines that already had A380s, such as your obviously Emirates, Singapore Airlines, British Airways, and so forth, they've brought their aircraft back online. Not least because some of those airlines actually retired some of their 747s, for example, so they need the lift to come back. Yeah. So that's what's helping the A380s to come back.
Yeah, I was going to ask why would British Airways bring almost all of theirs back? I think they've got 11 out of 12 back in operation. Whereas we've seen Lufthansa Air France really saying, we don't need these anymore. So,
yeah, I think for some of the airlines, there was a decision probably even pre-pandemic that actually the aircraft didn't really fit in the fleet. They want to reduce the complexity of their fleets. One of the issues with the A380 is the fleets tend to be quite small. Even British Airways, which is the fourth largest user, only has 12 aircraft. That creates a lot of cost and complexity, and of course the aircraft isn't now particularly efficient compared to some of the newer models coming in, such as the A350 and soon the 779.
Yeah, and of course British Airways did retire 22, 23 747-400s. Yeah. So there was a big gap to fill. I was going to ask about passenger comfort because, frankly, as a flying customer, if I'm flying long haul, I actually look for an A380. I actually think it's a great experience. It's very quiet. So, do you know how the feedback's going with airlines? Do passengers like the A380 compared to other choices out there?
Look, A380 has always been very popular with customers. It is a quiet aircraft. You notice that. I remember the first time taking off an A380, I thought the pilots had forgotten to set full power. It is that quiet. It's a great airplane. So I think it still gets customer feedback, but ultimately, things will be dictated by boring economics.
Yeah.
And if the economics doesn't work, then the A380, won't be used.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, Hash. I mean, we had seen pressure on A380 values and other wide-body values pre-pandemic anyway, hadn't we? I mean,
Absolutely.
2019.
Yeah, it started around sort of 28 period when first Singapore aircraft returned from its lease, and obviously couldn't find a secondary replacement, and it sat on the ground for a while, and then eventually got parted out. So that was the turning point. The secondary market hasn't developed at all. If you think about the length of the program, it first entered into service in 2007. It's been over 15 years. The only secondary market actually I can recall is the high flight wet leasing one. Apart from that, it's always been tear downs. So unless there's a secondary market, it's hard to sustain the values in a long term.
Yeah, and I think that's probably not surprising. I can remember when it came into service, and I think we were looking at the price of a new aircraft when it came into service, say 15 years ago.
Yeah.
By the time an airline has put its buy furnished equipment on, I think some of these were $250, $260 million, and have been getting closer to $300 million. So I think we were being asked questions then as to what would the real value be after 12 years. So, and clearly it didn't work for some because some have been scrapped at that point.
Essentially, yeah.
But where do we have sort of a 5-year-old aircraft, Hash? What are we showing what were we showing pre-pandemic as a value
Yeah.
versus what we're showing now?
Yeah, if my memory serves right, 2017, a 5-year-old then, I think we were valuing around 140 million. And we had a steady sort of curve up all the way to 2018, 2019. Then the value sharply dropped to about a third of that. And so, currently we are around about 50 million for a 5-year-old A380. So that's big drop
Yeah.
in the last 5 years. So that sort of showcases the value performance of this aircraft.
Yeah, Geoff, I was going to say then, when I can remember the sales pitch 15, maybe 20 years ago when sort of the thing was being launched, was all around the way the big hubs in the world were going. There was going to be a lot of slot constraint. It wouldn't just be the likes of Heathrow, Frankfurt and JFK. That the world was heading towards huge growth and slot constraints, so the A380 was going to solve those problems. But I presume now that, are we getting those issues? I mean, is it going to get back? I mean, you mentioned 83%, but...
Yeah, I mean, the old debate was, are we going to stay with hubs or is the future more point-to-point on long haul? And the answer is still, actually, we need both. I still think hubs definitely have their purpose, still very efficient, but we are seeing more long haul point-to-point. Things like the A3 aircraft like the A321 and also the 787-9s have a much longer range. But the reality is, and the A380 is perfect on a lot of those dense routes between slot-constrained hubs, and that does serve a purpose. But there's also, a massive downside risk. If you don't fill that aircraft, you've got 500 seats to fill, more with some airlines. If you don't fill them, then you burn a lot of cash. So a lot of airlines would prefer to have actually a smaller aircraft, twin-engined, and if demand does exceed supply, they simply yield upwards. Remember, airlines don't have to, they're quite happy at running at 100% capacity, and you can spill demand. What's a disaster for an airline is to run at 50 or 60% load factor.
Yeah, I was looking at some of the routes, and I experienced this myself in the summer. Bear in mind, it was the summer, so strong demand. British Airways would do a daily Heathrow to Vancouver with an A380, whilst Air Canada were doing twice daily. The first flight was a 777-300ER, second was a 787-9. I suppose for me, I'm thinking Air Canada didn't have the option of A380s. Were they kicking themselves, thinking this would have been great to put an A380 on this, or do they think, well, actually it gives us flexibility. We could put 2 777s on if there's really strong demand, or we could swap a 787-9 for a -8 if there's less demand. So is that what happens?
I think that is
basis?
right. I mean, what tends to happen, when demand reduces for a network airline, what they prefer to do is keep flying to all the destinations, but actually reduce the amount of frequencies. And so, even large international carriers such as Singapore Airlines, Lufthansa and BA, they never had a fleet more than 17 in the case of Singapore. That's a small fleet, and it does create a lot of complexity. You don't really have a crew. The crew becomes really too small to be efficient because they need to be type rated in the aircraft. The maintenance, and then you need to put in all the infrastructure required in the airports, bigger lounges, taxiways. So I think some of the added cost of complexity perhaps wasn't taken into account when airlines bought the A380.
Yeah, I mean, I experienced a flight coming back from Singapore with Singapore Airlines where the crew were very proud to say there's 4 pilots on board today and there's 28 cabin crew to serve you. I think there was 80 people on that flight. It had to operate because it was coming back full from London. But I think the issue there is, just putting those people into a hotel for the night, getting them transported backwards and forwards, that it really becomes a fixed cost. So I suppose that's my issue with the aircraft when it was originally launched, was that the cash operating cost just to get the aircraft in the air is huge compared to, let's say, a twin engine wide body. So was it inevitable that the production run would just be for was it 15 years, Hash, for
Up
production
until,
run?
give or take.
251
Around about
aircraft,
51, yeah, correct.
of which half were with Emirates. So
Yeah.
it gave us a problem. I'll ask Hash now. This whole concept of residual value, it was a bit of a nightmare for us,
It was.
wasn't it, as appraisers, to actually
Absolutely, trying
see
to
that
sort
future
of
value.
project the future values. Because in one hand, we also had to take the BFV into consideration, which was, in some cases it was, touching 60 million on top of the market value at the time. So it's a bit, like Phil said, it was a bit of a head scratcher. But I think in the first 12 years, I think the values were sort of getting down to about 60-70% of the the new delivery price. So that's where we initially sort of projected our values.
Yeah. Geoff, do you think there was a lot of discussion probably 10 years ago? Tim Clark at Emirates was saying, well, we need the new engine option, we need the more efficient engine. Do you think that would have saved the programme?
I think it would have given it a fighting chance. I think Emirates would have bought more aircraft. I think Emirates is a kind of different business model to a lot of airlines. 70% of their passengers approximately connect. So actually for their model, having the largest aircraft really makes sense. And so it's notable they brought the aircraft back. I think they would have liked to extend the life with new engines. But I think realistically for the engine manufacturers, it's just too big a risk to put into development a new engine when really the future is very uncertain.
Yeah, and Dubai, of course, has got some extreme operating conditions. The temperature on the ground and the say the salt and sand contamination. It's a harsh environment for engines. So I could see why perhaps Emirates were pushing for an engine upgrade, whereas perhaps the other operators were kind of getting by with what there was. So configurations, I mean, there's several different types of configurations. Geoff, I was going to ask you about this. We saw, is it right to say we've seen a decline in business class travel, and perhaps we would see reconfigurations with more premium economy seats in A380s, or?
I think at IBA actually we've been quite sort of anti-consensus since the pandemic. A lot of people are saying that business class would disappear, and this is a disaster for the business model of the legacy full service carriers. Actually, we always thought that let's differentiate between business class and also the passengers travelling. So business class has always been half full of leisure, half full of business. And actually, we've seen the cabins very full coming out of the pandemic. A lot of it with leisure passengers probably actually wanting more space due to concerns about health. But actually, business travel itself has also been returning. It isn't at pre-pandemic levels. I think on premium economy, really, a lot of the early pioneers of premium economy proved there was definitely a market for this. So I think people are putting premium economy in because it's a very profitable cabin. If you look at what you earn per floor space, it's arguably the most profitable cabin for many airlines. More profitable, arguably, per square foot than first class. So that's the reason why Emirates have put it in, because it's a great cabin that fits nicely between business class and economy. So you've got that difference in price point.
Hash, I was going to ask you about some of the operators who bought the A380 back to service.
Yeah.
I think Qantas originally said they would be grounding theirs for 3 years, but they have bought them back.
They have brought, I think, about half of their fleet now. I think 5 sort of in service. I think serving Sydney, London, Melbourne, London, Los Angeles. I think it's few routes. They still got 5 grounded. I think they have plans to bring them back. I think in 23. I think it's not confirmed yet. There's few other operators. I think Lufthansa. I know they have plans. Don't think they have brought theirs yet. I think this summer next year is their plan to bring them back. BA, of course, have most of their aircraft on operation now. Singapore, again, they got majority of their aircraft flying. Asiana as well, they got 3, I think, flying now. I think those are sort of key operators, I think.
But
Emirates, of course, they were about 80 odd.
if we go back to pre-COVID, there'd already been a couple of aircraft that were parted out. What was the story behind those?
Yeah, they were the first Singapore aircraft that got returned from lease, I think after 10 years. Bearing in mind they were low takeoff weight aircraft. I think they had 510,000 maximum takeoff weight. Obviously they sat on the ground, no second replacements. They eventually got torn down. Engines, I believe, got leased out to other aircraft operators. But the rest.
And were those the Rolls powered, or was that the Alliance engine on those?
So yeah, I think they're Rolls powered.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hash, I want to ask you on a practical and pragmatic point, really. What are clients asking from us, of us, in terms of the valuation side now? Banks, leasing companies with these aircraft. What's the sort of typical questions we're getting?
Yeah, the typical sort of clients would be banks, lessors, etc. Yeah, the typical. Lately we've been looking at residual values, sort of values at lease end, from primarily from a tear down perspective, because traditionally we used to do base value, residual values, but with regards to A380, we have been a lot of part out values.
Yeah.
Or scrapping some instances, but not base value where we.
Yeah, because there's no new deliveries coming along. It's all about what is the value of the metal from a parts out perspective.
We also sort of shorten the economic life of the aircraft as well.
Okay. That seems sensible.
Yeah.
Geoff, on the broader advisory side, including technical, what's a typical solution we provide to clients along those lines?
Sure, I think we're getting more and more approaches from airlines asking us our advice about fleet. It's obviously the biggest capex decision that airlines make, and I think sometimes they want a second opinion on residual values, on actually the appropriate costs of the fleet, taking into account maintenance reserves, and operating costs, and also which aircraft are the best going forward, taking into account all of the new ESG legislation in Europe, for example.
So, I was going to say one of the areas that I got involved with, Hash, was airlines and lessors and banks indeed. I mean, it's one thing IBA providing residual values, but ultimately that's being used in a discussion with auditors over impairment, because as we've said, a 5-year-old aircraft in 2017, we might have been valuing at 140 or 150 million.
Yeah.
And today, management of those airlines is sort of saying, well, we're still operating the aircraft, but actually, if its market value now, maybe 60 million.
Yeah.
So that can help in some respect once they take the hit on that. But I think that discussion in terms of where our values are being used, it's not just a number to put in a spreadsheet, it's got a practical impact on an airline's P&L and an audit process where management are being asked tough questions by auditors in terms of what is the value of that aircraft. Without getting too deep, this is really driven by IFRS or GAAP, and the questions we've been asked over the last few years with many wide bodies, it's not just the A380, is do we value the aircraft at market value, or do we value it based on its cash generating unit? And I think probably what we've seen here, aircraft which are being earmarked for scrappage, retirement, the airline has to take a market value.
Yeah.
Whereas if it's in operation, it can actually show auditors, look, this aircraft, it's operating daily. Let's say a BA A380 that's doing daily, whether it's Vancouver, Miami, LA, San Francisco, it becomes a cash generating unit. So the airline can provide data. We help in those areas of providing independent responses to say, as a cash generating unit, this aircraft has a value of X as opposed to the market value of Y.
Value in use sort of
Yeah.
exercise.
And I think that's something we're good at here at IBA.
Yeah.
We're not just a bunch of analysts in an ivory tower somewhere. We've got people and folks who've worked at airlines. We've got some great analysts, of course, but it's that blend of practical and pragmatic frontline experience blended with the analytics and data that's needed so much in the industry. Okay. So, yes or no, there is a future for some A380s. That was probably an easy question to answer.
Yeah.
But we still do see a future in certain circumstances for the A380. Is that a fair conclusion?
Yes.
Yes, it is.
I agree.
Well, I'd like to thank Hash and Geoff for joining me today for this chat through the A380. Thank you.
Thank you.